Hey, I'm golf broadcaster Matt Adams. The updated and expanded second edition of my book, The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments, is now available. Readers can expect to march with Arnie's Army at the 1960 U.S. Open, relive Jack Nicklaus's remarkable 1986 Masters win, and be amazed by the Tiger Slam. The Golf Round I'll Never Forget, Golf's Biggest Stars Recall Their Finest Moments. Pick it up where fine books sold, including barnesandnoble.com and amazon.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Numbers don't lie. Over the course of his career, Bullet Joe Rogan established himself as, well, not only one of the best of his era, but as one of the best in the history of the game. The fact that he played for the Kansas City Monarchs of the Negro National League and baseball fans across the country were not privy to what he did on the field during his career, well, that's a shame, because whether he was firing strikes past batter after batter or taking pitchers deep when he dug in as the cleanup hitter for the Monarchs, that's a big miss for all of us. And next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to take a look back at the Hall of Fame career of one of baseball's greatest, Bullet Joe Rogan.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 136, Bullet Joe Rogan. I am thrilled to bring this episode to you. Not only are we going to talk about one of the greatest to ever play the game, but I have a very special guest to tell us about Bullet, the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, Bob Kendrick. This is actually Bob's second appearance on Sports Forgotten Heroes, as he was my guest for a terrific talk about the American League's first ever player to cross the color barrier, Larry Doby. No one, and I mean no one, knows his subject matter better than Bob, and I can't think of anyone who speaks with as much passion about the greats of the Negro Leagues than Bob does. And Bullet Joe Rogan, well, he's certainly one of the greats. In fact, there are many who think he was as good as anyone who played the game before him, with him, or after him, whether it was in the Negro Leagues or Major League Baseball. And Bob and I are going to talk about the incredible stats Bullet accumulated, his uncanny ability on the mound, and the power he generated despite his small stature in the four-hole of the Kansas City Monarchs lineup. Before we do, a couple of reminders. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes. Follow on Facebook, and you can listen virtually anywhere podcasts are posted, or you can actually watch today's show on YouTube on the Sports Forgotten Heroes channel. Okay, Bullet Joe Rogan. In 1920, when the Negro National League and the Kansas City Monarchs started play, Bullet Joe Rogan firmly established himself as one of the league's best. And when he took his cleats off for the last time in 1938, he had established himself as one of the greatest to ever play. And here, to tell us more about Bullet, is my special guest, the president of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, Bob Kendrick. Bob, thanks for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. So happy to have you back.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Warren. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely. It's like I said, it's a thrill and an honor. I really enjoyed our conversation a few years ago about Larry Doby, and now to do a show on Bullet Joe Rogan, no relation. It's it's great. Bob, you must also be thrilled right now with all that's going on when it comes to Negro League baseball, particularly with the stats being included in the official baseball records. Tell us a little bit about that journey and how gratifying it is for all of this to finally happen and for everyone to get their recognition.
Yeah. Well, it's been it's been an amazing run for Negro Leagues history and Warren, the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. We're so proud that we've had at least a hand in helping some of these milestone occasions occur. You referenced the rolling of the statistics of the Negro Leagues into the annals of Major League Baseball history. This was something that was long overdue and well deserved. I think honestly, a lot of people did not know that in 1969, Major League Baseball put together a commission to examine all of the professional baseball leagues that operated in this country. And the Negro Leagues were blatantly disregarded. I mean, leagues like the Federal League and some other leagues that had not nearly the significance of the Negro Leagues were rolled into the annals of Major League Baseball's record books. But the Negro Leagues had been blatantly disregarded. And Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred essentially righted a wrong. And in December of 2020, while we were right in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, Commissioner Manfred announced that Major League Baseball, first and foremost, was going to at long last recognize the Negro Leagues for certainly what we already knew it to be, a major league, and that it was going to roll in the statistics of the Negro Leagues into the record books of Major League Baseball. And earlier this year, as you know, that those numbers were officially entered into the record books of Major League Baseball, thanks to a dream team of Negro League historians who gave of themselves tirelessly to pull together this quantitative data that was necessary to make this happen. But man, it was a watershed moment for Black baseball history, for Negro Leagues history, and I dare say American history. And you couple that with the recent salute to the Negro Leagues at Rick Wood Field, which had the eye of the baseball world watching this celebration of the Negro Leagues at a place that a 17-year-old kid by the name of Willie Mays began his illustrious professional baseball career. This was also monumental. And so these things have really led to, I think, heightened interest in the Negro Leagues. We are feeling it at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, which I am tremendously excited about. And as I mentioned, very proud of our role in helping shape some of these milestone events that we're seeing around Negro Leagues history.
And one day I'm going to make it out there. I try to do my part when I can. I love baseball, just love it, and I've had you on to talk about Larry Doby. We've talked about Oscar Charleston on my show, and Effa Manley, who is just a terrific story as well. Today we're talking about Bullet Joe Rogan. And if you can, there are so many greats who have played Negro League, who've been in the Negro Leagues, who, have never been discussed. And I don't think Bullet Joe Rogan gets enough recognition for the kind of ball player he was. If you can, please give us a quick synopsis of who Bullet Joe Rogan was.
Wilbur Bullet Rogan. He was, in my opinion, one of the two first superstars of the Negro Leagues when it was established in 1920. Now, there were a lot of stars in Rube Foster's newly established Negro National League, but Bullet Rogan and Oscar Charleston were superstars. Yeah, they were in another stratosphere, so to speak. And Bullet Rogan was a tremendous athlete, even though, Warren, he didn't look like an athlete. And I'm so excited that the phenomena who is Shohei Ohtani, the great Japanese ball player.
You found him in here too.
I am so glad that his success has led folks to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum to talk about some of the great two-way stars of the Negro Leagues. Bullet Rogan, I believe, was that first great two-way star. And honestly, if you were going to draw a comparison to someone, Ruth is not really the comparison. And I know that's the natural comparison that people want to make when they look at what Shohei has done as a two-way star in Major League Baseball. Bullet Rogan is really the comparison, although when we look at them physically, they are on the opposite end of the spectrum. Shohei is a large man. I was so surprised at how big that young man is. Bullet Rogan might have been 5'7", 5'8", weighed 175 pounds. Satchel Paige would call him a chunky fella. But he was a tremendous athlete. Bullet Rogan is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame as a pitcher. And he was one of the Negro League's dominant pitchers. But when he wasn't pitching, Bullet Rogan hit cleanup and played the outfield for the Kansas City Monarchs. Now, you don't just hit cleanup for the Kansas City Monarchs. If you're hitting in the cleanup spot, you better be able to rake. And Bullet Rogan could indeed rake. Satchel Paige, in beautiful Satchel Paige vernacular, would say of Bullet Rogan that he was the onlyest ball player he ever seen, he ever heard of, that pitched and hit in the cleanup position. Bullet Rogan led the Negro Leagues in stolen bases, man, when he was 38 years old. Yeah, he was a tremendous athlete. He pitched, I should say, with a no wind-up delivery. And yet his nickname was Bullet because he could get it up there in a hurry.
Bob, admittedly, I am not very familiar with a historian by the name of Phil Dixon.
Uh-huh.
I imagine you know who he is.
Yeah, Phil lives here in Kansas City.
Yeah, and I'm going somewhere with this. Would you just tell us a little bit about Phil and his contributions to baseball as a historian?
Well, Phil is one of the top Negro League historians and researchers in the country. He lives here in Kansas City. He was part of the early organizing of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum from its inception. He's the author of a number of books, including one on the life and times of Wilbur Bullet Rogan. And so he is, too, an authority on Negro Leagues history. And he makes a legitimate case that you can make the argument that Bullet Rogan might have been the greatest baseball player of all time.
Well, that's where I'm going. Again, like I said, I'm going somewhere with all this because now I go to Oscar Charleston. Many say that Oscar might be one of the top 3, 4, 5 ball players of all time, regardless of what league you're talking about. And I did do a podcast a few years ago about Oscar. Now, like you did for Joe, can you tell us a little bit about Oscar, the kind of ball player that he was?
Well, Buck O'Neil believed that Oscar Charleston was the greatest baseball player he ever saw. Now, he thought Willie Mays, the late, great Willie Mays, to be the greatest major leaguer that he ever saw. But he considered Oscar Charleston to be the greatest baseball player that he ever saw. Oscar Charleston was the quintessential five-tool player. Hit for power, hit for average, could field, could run, could throw. In 1921, Oscar Charleston had one of the greatest seasons in baseball history, playing for then the St. Louis Stars, when he led the Negro Leagues in home runs, triples, doubles, stolen bases, and batting average in the same season. The old-timers in the Negro Leagues would say the closest thing to Oscar Charleston would have been Willie Mays. And man, that's scary to think. Oscar Charleston had uncanny instincts as a center fielder in his prime. Buck O'Neil says he never saw a center fielder, including Willie Mays, who could go back on a ball the way Charleston could. He just had uncanny instincts. He seemed to know where that baseball was coming down right off the crack of the bat. So he played a very shallow center field. So you couldn't bloop it in front of him. And unless you hit it on a rope, you couldn't get it over his head. I tell the story all the time. Most people have seen The Catch.
Yes.
And of course, since Mr. Mays' passing, we've seen a lot of replays of The Catch. But baseball fans who didn't know who Willie Mays was or saw him play, they've seen the great catch that he makes there in the Polo Grounds in the World Series, that great running over-the-shoulder basket catch. And honestly, the throw was better than the catch. But the magnitude of the moment and the fact that it was the World Series, everybody remembers the catch. Well, the old-timers in the Negro League say, had that been Oscar Charleston, he'd have been waiting for that ball to come down. That's how uncanny Charleston was. And Buck would say one of the strongest men he had ever seen. Said that Charleston could take a baseball, put it between both palms, and turn the leather on the baseball. Just freakishly strong. Yeah, that was Oscar Charleston.
So this is where I'm going. And I think to me, it really stinks that we don't have all of the true, complete records from all these great ball players who played back in the day in the Negro Leagues. But as Phil points out, during his research, these numbers, he said that Bullet won more than 350 games as a pitcher, struck out more than 2,000 batters, accumulated more than 2,500 hits, 350 home runs, and 500 stolen bases. Bob, how the heck do we not know more about Bullet Joe Rogan than we do? He has got to be right there with Oscar, if not ahead of Oscar, and who knows who else, one of the top 5 of all time. Just how good was he? Tell us, what kind of a ball player was Bullet Joe? How good was he?
As Buck O'Neil would say, he was better than that. Yeah, he was an outstanding ball player. And Bullet Rogan was part of the legendary 25th Infantry Wreckers, one of the greatest military teams, all-black military team, one of the greatest military teams ever. They dominated everybody. And that is where most of the guys on that Wreckers team would become early members of the Kansas City Monarchs when they were a charter member of the Negro National League in 1920. Rogan, Lemuel Hawkins, Heavy Johnson, these guys were all part of that great Wreckers team, and Rogan dominated on every level of play that he participated in. He's older by the time he gets to the Negro Leagues, and he was still tremendous. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the very first Negro Leagues World Series, held in 1924 between our Kansas City Monarchs and the Hilldale Club out of Darby, Pennsylvania. The Monarchs would win that inaugural World Series, becoming Kansas City's first major professional sports team champion of any kind in 1924. And they were led, of course, by Hall of Famer Wilbur Bullet Rogan, and also Hall of Famer, great Cuban ball player, Jose the Black Diamond Mendez. But Rogan was the star. And in 25, the two combatants meet again, and the Hilldale team won that World Series primarily because Rogan missed that World Series because of an injury. That's how good Bullet Rogan was.
Well, you brought up the name earlier, Shohei Ohtani, and, that's who we have today. And, you got to be sleeping underneath a rock if you don't know about Babe Ruth, obviously. That's the kind of player that Joe was. He was a Shohei Ohtani. He played pitcher, and he was a hitter. Babe Ruth, again, there are some people that don't know, he was a great pitcher before he became solely an outfielder. There have been very few in the history of baseball that could do what Bullet did, what Shohei does, what Babe Ruth did. Where did this all come from? Tell us about Bullet's introduction to the game and how and where he refined his skills.
Well, I think his love for baseball, like most of those who follow this game, in Bullet Rogan's case, was able to take that passion he had for the game and go ahead and play at the professional level, which the Negro Leagues opened up that opportunity. The Negro Leagues were established in 1920. So the same year that Rogan plays for the Kansas City Monarchs, that is part of that inaugural season in 1920. And that's why I talked about Rogan and Charleston being the Negro League's first two superstars, because they were part. Charleston at that time was a member of the Indianapolis ABCs. Rogan, of course, was doing his thing for the Kansas City Monarchs. And both of them just kind of burst on the baseball scene from a professional baseball standpoint. Rogan had already been doing his thing in the military, playing for that 25th Infantry Wreckers team, which was dynamite. And so, again, the thing that strikes me is when you look at him on surface level, he didn't strike you as a great athlete because he didn't look like what we would think a great athlete would look like, but he was. Everything about him. As a pitcher, I mentioned the fact that he pitched with a no windup delivery, but he also had a devastating curveball. Buck O'Neil would describe his fastball as a heavy fastball. And he threw a palm ball. He threw basically the kitchen sink at you. But then when he wasn't pitching, as I mentioned, he played the outfield. So it wasn't, you didn't get any rest. You played the outfield and hit cleanup. That is unprecedented. You just don't hear of that. And Rogan was doing that way back in 1920. And he had a lifetime batting average of well over 300 and had 20-game winner kind of stuff for the Monarchs. He just dominated everyone.
You talk a little bit about the Wreckers in the Army. I don't know if you can answer this question. How did they put that team together? Because there wasn't Negro League baseball back there, when Joe enlisted. How did they find all these guys and put them together? And how did they create such a great team?
Yeah, but this goes back to World War I, and there seems to have been a long history of military baseball. And so black enlistees were playing baseball on those military teams as well, segregated military baseball teams, just as they were segregated military units. All those guys from that 25th Infantry Wreckers team would have been considered members of the Buffalo Soldiers. And, in that case, Jackie Robinson was a Buffalo Soldier. And so, but baseball has always been a prominent and prevalent part of African-American heritage. We have a tremendous legacy in this game that goes back to the 1800s. And there is evidence of us playing as enslaved people. So this was not a new phenomena of blacks playing baseball. We've always played this game, and quite frankly, we've always been good at this game. It was just that society was trying to prevent them from playing this so-called America's national pastime. And the Negro Leagues fueled that opportunity for them to play professional baseball, a league that was mirrored right after Major League Baseball. And it would represent the highest level in which an African-American, and in many cases, a Spanish-speaking athlete could play baseball in this country. And so, but there has always been this long-standing passion for the game within the African-American community.
Can you tell us a little bit more about his enlisting? If I follow the story correctly, he dropped out of school but he wasn't old enough to enlist. So
He lied about his age.
Yeah.
Yeah, he lied about his age. Oscar Charleston lied about his age to enlist in the Army. Oscar Charleston was 15 years old when he went into the Army, and then eventually served in World War One. And so Rogan, same thing, lied about his age to enlist, and they were rough and tumble. They had life experiences that made them tough, and you could see that. You could see that toughness in the way that they played the game. But they had been prepared because life had basically presented every opportunity for them to be prepared to deal with whatever might come their way. If you could imagine, again, in the case of Oscar Charleston, 15 years old, and he's serving in the U.S. Army.
Wow. Back to the field, Joe did play against some great ball players, regardless color of the skin. One of them was Casey Stengel, and Casey said that Bullet was one of the best ball players, period, that he ever saw. Others said they would rather have Joe on their team instead of a guy like Satchel, because Joe was
more things
good at both sides of the game. BaseballReference.com notes Joe's record as a pitcher for the Monarchs with 120 wins, 52 losses, a 2.65 ERA. All of that with the Monarchs. Tell us more about Joe as a pitcher. You said he didn't have a windup, but he was able, and you talk about his stature, and he was just able to get up there and sling that ball. Tell us a little more about his game as a pitcher.
Well, dominant. He was dominant because Rogan was never scared. It seemingly was never scared of the moment. The bigger the stage, the better he was. But that's typically what you see with the great ones. Those situations bring out the greatness in them. Some of the other guys might buckle under the pressure, but Rogan seemed like he was built for whatever the moment was, and he was always able to rise to the occasion. And he really was the main cog in the wheel that made the Monarchs go those early years in the Negro Leagues. Again, along with the brilliance of Jose Mendez, two Hall of Fame pitchers that the Monarchs had in those early years there in 1920 when the Monarchs moved into the Negro Leagues as a charter member, one of 8 original Negro League teams that were part of the Negro National League in 1920. But Rogan, as the young people would say, he had the goods. He had everything that you needed. He threw the repertoire at you. And like I said, he was just always would rise above whatever the adversity was, whatever the pressure-packed moments seemed to be. He believed that he could get you out as a pitcher. And of course, as a hitter and an outfielder, he was also superb.
350 home runs, more than 500 stolen bases, over 2,500 hits. I mean, these are numbers that are just kooky crazy. When we think about ball players and special performances, some of the catch by Willie Mays, Babe Ruth pointing in the outfield. Is it possible to call out any special performances, any game or games in particular that you can tell us about that Joe had?
Well, I don't know of any single moment that stands out above any of the rest. He was just so consistently good. But when things got difficult, they played ultimately they played 10 games in that 1924 World Series. One game was called because of darkness. The Monarchs would win that series 5-4. And Rogan really was the star of that series. He carried the Monarchs. And in the crucial game 9, I guess you would say, Jose Mendez, against the doctor's orders, gets in there and gets it done. But Rogan was really the star of that World Series. Uh, and I really believe that the Monarchs would have won back-to-back World Series if Rogan doesn't have the freak injury that kept him out of that series.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's go back again. Tell us about his upbringing. What was life like for Joe during his childhood years? What was
I
it?
think it, I think it was challenging for him, which is one of the reasons why he lied about his age and enlisted in the military. Grew up in Oklahoma, of course, and but I do think life was challenging, as life was challenging for Black folks in general in that era. Uh, Rogan's family life, I think, was also challenging, which again led him to lie about his age and enlist in the military, which may have been a blessing in disguise, because that is really when Bullet Rogan kind of rises to the forefront, because he's now able to play on this military baseball team. And that's what ultimately got him seen. So you're right. Casey Stengel saw Bullet Rogan as he saw other members of the 25th Infantry Wreckers, and recommended a lot of those guys to James Leslie Wilkinson, who owned the Kansas City Monarchs.
Mm-hmm. Here's a weird question for you. He was a part of the original Negro Leagues, starting with the Monarchs in 1920 and played with them through 38. At the time, this is, you're going to educate some people now. At the time of his becoming a ball player and going to play for Kansas City, how did children learn about the Negro Leagues? We didn't have social media like there is today to say, hey, come on out and watch so-and-so play. They didn't have highlights on TV. There wasn't TV. Did they see games? How was the league marketed to areas where there were no teams? How did people find out about the games? What was all that like?
Well, the Black press was instrumental both in pushing
and
for.
That's something that I don't think people know about. That
The Black press was instrumental. They were the voice of Black baseball. And honestly, had it not been for the Black press, we would know very little about the Negro Leagues. This is where this documentation comes from. This is where these historians have been able to go back into the archives and dig up these games. Mainstream media may have recorded a game or two here and there, but by and large, they ignored the Negro Leagues. Even as good as the Kansas City Monarchs were in our great city of Kansas City, the daily paper, the Kansas City Star, and then the Kansas City Times, very little coverage of the Monarchs. So the Black press became that primary voice of Black baseball. And the Negro Leagues were also at the forefront of barnstorming. They helped grow the game of baseball. And this is an aspect of the Negro Leagues that I don't think they get enough credit for. The Major Leaguers barnstormed as well, but they didn't barnstorm at the level that the Negro Leagues did. And so they are riding into towns all across this country that had not seen professional baseball. And this was their introduction to professional baseball. And in essence, they were helping grow the game because they were taking the game to the people. Yeah, and so they did as much to help promote the game of baseball as anyone, because they were their proliferation for barnstorming was so significant. I still hear people all the time come from all walks of life, and they'll say, well, my great-grandfather, he warmed up Satchel when Satchel came to our little town, and they were barnstorming in that town. And more times than not, their reputations preceded them. These fans, in most cases, were white fans. They had heard about these great Black ball players, and they wanted to see for themselves what these athletes could do. And more times than not, they put on a show for them.
Mm. Who would you say influenced, when it comes to baseball, who influenced Joe? Or do we call him Joe? Where does the name Joe come from?
Well, he seems to be called a lot of things. I think most of us just call him Bullet Rogan, because that is the moniker that he was tagged with. again, baseball has always been important in our community. So there were, I'm sure, early influences on Joe as it related to the game. And it's just something about baseball. You pick up that baseball, I don't know how he got started in the game, but I can imagine that once he picked up that baseball, there was something magical that happened with him, as it is with most of those great athletes when you're introduced to something that you absolutely fall in love. As Buck O'Neil would say, the first time he hit that ball, that was it. Yeah, you fall in love with it. And clearly Rogan had a tremendous passion for this game, and he stayed a part of the game even after he retired as a player. He became an umpire in the game. So baseball was, as baseball typically does, it gets in your soul. It's part of your DNA.
Yeah, once it's in your blood, it's there.
Yeah.
You talked about Jose Mendez, Bullet Rogan. Who are some of the other contemporaries that played with Joe during that period of time with the Monarchs in the league? And how good was Kansas City?
Oh, Kansas City was outstanding. Kansas City has had a tremendous legacy in Black baseball. The Monarchs were one of the greatest baseball franchises this sport has ever seen. They had a tremendous run in the Negro Leagues, one of the Negro Leagues' longest running teams. They had a brief period away from the Negro Leagues where they were primarily barnstorming, but they sent more players to the major leagues than any other Negro League franchise. They had one losing season in their almost 40-year existence in the Negro League.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, as I remind people all the time, there are those who will say that the Kansas City Monarchs were the New York Yankees of the Negro Leagues. There are others, however, who will say that the New York Yankees were the Kansas City Monarchs of Major League Baseball. They were that good. The season that they had the losing record in was during World War II, when so many of their great stars had been called into service. And so they've had a long-running reign of dominance. And I say this, and I say it with no disrespect to my beloved Kansas City Royals. The Kansas City Monarchs are still the greatest baseball franchise the city of Kansas City has ever seen. And as we celebrate that milestone 100th anniversary of them winning Kansas City's first major professional sports team championship of any kind, and this is a city that hangs his hat on its championship pedigree. I think the Kansas City Chiefs have 4 Super Bowl titles. Kansas City Royals have 2 World Series championships. Neither of those great sports franchises come even close to comparing to the winning legacy of the Kansas City Monarchs. And it's not even close.
Interesting. Who are some of the other contemporaries? I mean, some of the more popular names. And again, I don't know why this is. At least when I think about it and with people that I talk about, not many know about Bullet Joe.
No, because he's not a household name. Yeah. He should be, even though he's in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. But that's the plight of the Negro Leagues.
But why is
that's why this museum?
Yes. But why are they? And why is Buck Leonard and Cool Papa Bell and Buck O'Neil? Why are they more popular than a guy? And Oscar isn't that popular either.
No.
The 2 greatest Negro League baseball players of all time. It doesn't make sense.
And I shouldn't say misfortune, but they played at the early part of the Negro Leagues. And so those early era Negro Leaguers don't oftentimes get the love that those guys who came in the 40s, they kind of come along at a time when you had guys like Buck O'Neil still alive and Monty Irving still alive, and they're talking about their contemporaries. So we got to learn more through the oratorial skills of those individuals telling us about Josh Gibson and Cool Papa Bell and of course, Satchel Paige, because those names go mainstream. Yeah, they go mainstream. Rogan is so early era. Those 19th century ball players don't get nearly as much love because the people who saw them, by the time Negro League baseball history really emerges into the forefront of the consciousness of people in the 20th century, well, those guys are dead. They're long gone. And the people who saw them play are long gone. So you didn't have anybody really talking them up, and that's why it's important that the likes of Phil Dixon and the other Negro League historians have gone back and tried to bring these people to the forefront of baseball fans' consciousness, because they are players that we should know about and many don't know about. But that's also why it's important that we have a Negro Leagues baseball museum to also help people learn about the likes of Bullet Rogan and those early heroes that were such a prevalent part of the Negro Leagues when the leagues were first established. And because there were some tremendous players before the great Josh Gibsons and the Cool Papa Bells, the Satchel Pages of the world. Those names, as I mentioned, they are transcending kinds of names. Most baseball fans have at least heard those names. Now, Warren, they may not know how good these guys really were, but you've likely heard those names. But when we start to talk about the likes of Bullet Rogan, Jose Mendez, John Donaldson was before Rogan. And John Donaldson is who Satchel Paige modeled himself after. Yeah, and John Donaldson was one of the most dominant left-handed pitchers this game has ever seen. Over 400 verifiable wins, over 5,000 strikeouts, and they're still unearthing data on John Donaldson, and that's a name that virtually no one knows. Yeah. And so, but that's the plight of that early era Black baseball / Negro Leagues player.
And, in a way, it's the same thing with the major leagues from back then. Heck, I just did one on Wahoo Sam Crawford. A lot of people, he played with Ty Cobb. So Ty Cobb got the notoriety.
Got the press, exactly.
Right. And most people have never heard of Sam Crawford. And my gosh, that guy holds the major league record for triples, 309. No one would think about that. You'd think a guy more like Ricky Henderson or Vince Coleman, guys like that. Oh, they must have the triples record. No, it was some guy that played in the 19 teens, a white guy for the Detroit Tigers, whom you've never even heard of. It's crazy. It's crazy. So Bob, when Joe became a player manager, some said he was too tough, particularly on rookies. In fact, they say that he would play aging veterans instead of rookies because, well, they were his friends, and he just didn't trust those whom he didn't know well enough. He also had a very strict and regimented attitude, and a lot of people say that was brought on by his days in the Army. So talk to us a little bit about his days as a player manager and how he finally loosened up or softened up and how that affected.
I don't know if he ever really softened up, but, the great ones have the ability to adjust. And you do have a tendency to trust that older ball player. And I'm sure that Rogan's military background made it challenging for a lot of the young players to play for him. I remember Buck O'Neil talking about when he was player manager for the Monarchs and how he would look down the bench and every now and then he'd insert himself. He needed a pinch hitter. He looked down the bench and he said, wait a minute, I don't see anybody better than me. so he would insert himself and pinch hit. And I think Rogan, with the maturity and the experiences that he had gained, he's kind of saw baseball through that same lens. Those players that he trusted, even though they were mature players, but again, over time, he started to adjust his style. But I think that managerial role was probably challenging for him because, as it is for the great ones, the great ones think that everybody should be able to do what they were able to do. I listened to Satchel talk about his ability to look at the batter's knees on his swing and tell how he could get him out. Or he'd say stuff like, home plate don't move, just throw strike. Well, it ain't that easy. And I think that is the case why you didn't see a lot of great ball players become managers, because they just think that everybody can do what they were able to do and people can't.
Yeah, I always wondered how a guy like Ted Williams was able to stomach managing a team like Washington, the Senators back then. I mean, that guy must have had so many ulcers from not, they can't do what the greats did, like you talk about. Hey, of course, when you talk about the Negro Leagues and what life was like, I'd be remiss if we didn't discuss the culture from back then. And I always find this a difficult topic for me because I never want to insult anyone. But how did Bullet handle the racial discrimination and segregation that was prevalent during his playing days?
Well, I think that you'll see this be the case. I think in African American culture in general, you were trained on how to handle it, because those were the conditions that you knew existed. And I would call it survival skills. You learn those survival skills. Life on the road was tough for these ball players. And I don't care what era you played in during that particular era of segregation. Life on the road was tough. Not knowing where you could get something to eat, not having a place to stay. The bus essentially became your place of refuge. It was your restaurant. It was your hotel. And yet you were filling up ballparks with fans who were expecting to see a show. Yet you couldn't get a meal from those same fans who had just cheered you. So yes, life was difficult. It was challenging socially for those players in the Negro Leagues. But as I talk about oftentimes with my guests at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, what you have to admire about the story of the Negro Leagues is that these athletes never allowed that set of social circumstances to kill their love of the game. Yes, so sleeping on the bus, eating your peanut butter and crackers because you couldn't get a meal, that never deterred them from wanting to play this game. And somehow or another, they were able to rise above those social challenges and play this game at its highest level. It is remarkable what they were able to do under such excruciating circumstances when they were traveling this country to play this game.
Yeah. In what ways did Bullet influence and change the game of baseball?
Oh, people don't know it, but that's what we've been talking about. That's where the comparison to Shohei Ohtani comes from. And that's why I'm so excited that Shohei's success has opened up the opportunity for us to talk about the great two-way stars of the Negro Leagues, because the league was filled with those great two-way stars. A lot of it was out of necessity because they didn't have the roster sizes that were as large as Major League Baseball's roster. So you didn't have a 25-man roster. So you weren't going to have a dedicated 4-5-man pitching rotation like you saw in Major League Baseball. So versatility was premium. You needed to have pitchers who could do multiple things. And so it was pretty commonplace in the Negro Leagues that when you weren't pitching, you were playing another position. Mm. And so most of the pitchers in the Negro Leagues were pretty good hitters. Now, when Satchel got a hit, he gonna tell you about it. But when your stuff is as good as Satchel, well, you don't need to. You just focus on pitching. Yeah, that's all you need to do. But most of the pitchers in the Negro Leagues were pretty good hitters, and they were going to play multiple positions. And so that opportunity to talk about that, and it's not just Bullet Rogan. Hilton Smith, who pitched for the Monarchs. Hilton Smith is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. When Hilton Smith wasn't pitching, he played the outfield, won a Triple Crown in the Negro League. And Buck O'Neill says the greatest curveball he's ever seen. My dear friend, the late, great Monty Irvin, would say that Hilton Smith's curveball was so good that you could know that it was coming, and the break on it was so sharp, and you still couldn't hit it. Yeah, and so very few folks know about Hilton Smith, even though Hilton Smith is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Hilton was on the same teams with Satchel Paige. When Satchel Paige walked in the room lit up. You knew Satchel was in the room, and if you didn't know Satchel was in the room, Satchel was going to let you know that he was in the room. But Hilton Smith was the polar opposite. Quiet, unassuming, workmanlike, but just as lethal. And he was a great two-way star, the likes of Ted Double Duty Radcliffe, who earned his nickname Double Duty. When the great sports writer Damon Runyon saw Duty catch a Satchel Paige shutout in the first game of a doubleheader, pulled off the catcher's gear, took the mound, and threw a shutout in the second game of the doubleheader, said he was worth the price of 2 admissions. He was nicknamed Double Duty, and I mean, he is one. I believe Double Duty should be in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. But guys like the great Martin DeHigo nicknamed him El Maestro, the master, because he could do it all. Warren played all 9 positions and played all 9 of them well. He is the only baseball player in the history of our sport to be enshrined into 5 different countries' baseball halls of fame. He's in the Mexican, Cuban, Venezuelan, Dominican, and in Cooperstown.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, these were tremendous baseball players. Leon Day and Monty Irvin, who was a teammate of Leon Day when they both were playing for the Newark Eagles. Hall of Famer Monty Irvin, Leon Day, too, is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And he says, if you saw Bob Gibson pitch, you saw Leon Day pitch. That's who he was compared to. That same kind of dogged determination, but Leon Day played multiple positions. Buck O'Neill swore to the day he died that Leon Day was a better center fielder than he was pitcher, and Leon Day is in the National Baseball Hall of Fame as a pitcher. Those are just a few examples of the great two-way stars of the Negro Leagues. So thank you, Shohei Ohtani, for opening up that door of opportunity to talk about that aspect of Negro Leagues history.
Well, let's wrap this up with this. What is Bullet's legacy, and if you had to tell somebody why they should know about Bullet, what do you say?
Because Bullet Rogan is one of the greatest baseball players few folks know anything about. And tremendous competitor, just a tremendous baseball player. And as a baseball fan, you should want to know who Wilbur Bullet Rogan was, because he was that gifted, a tremendous athlete, and one heck of a winner. That was Bullet Rogan.
That's awesome. Hey, Bob, finally, tell us about the museum. I know I've asked you about this before, but let's do it again. How it continues to grow, special events, just how special it is.
Yeah, no, it's a very special place, and we're so proud of the work of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. I encourage everyone, if you get the opportunity to come to Kansas City, please make the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum a stop, because I think it is a must stop when you come to Kansas City. It is one of the greatest civil rights, social justice institutions in this country. It's just seen through the lens of baseball. And it is a place where America kind of comes home at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. And it's really special. It's just a special, special place. This year, as I mentioned, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Monarchs winning the first World Series. And we've been very fortunate to have a slew of events and activities there at the museum. We're constantly creating programs. We have a brand new exhibition on the history of the Kansas City Monarchs. We could have done an entire museum on the Monarchs, but we wanted to put our focus on the general national story of the Negro Leagues. But this new exhibit chronicles the history of the Kansas City Monarchs from its origins in 1920 through the bitter end. By the time the club still was barnstorming in the 1960s, but the Negro Leagues had long shut its doors. And a litany of great stars that call the Kansas City Monarchs home. It's really very, very special. And I hope people get a chance to come and visit this museum. We're excited about plans to build a brand new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. We announced last May our plans to understand the evolution of this museum. It started in a one-room office in 1990. We opened what I thought was going to be our permanent home in November of 1997. Went from a one-room office to about 10,000 square feet of exhibit space. So it's not an overwhelmingly large footprint, but within those 10,000 square feet is a lot of information. But we've now outgrown our current home. And so last May, we announced plans to build a new 30-plus thousand square foot Negro Leagues Baseball Museum here at historic 18th and Vine in Kansas City. And that's a long way from that one-room office that this project got started in. And for anyone who is interested in supporting the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, and of course our Pitch for the Future campaign to build a new Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, please visit us at www.nlbm.com. You can go to the donation tab and you can make a charitable contribution to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. So we thank you in advance for your support considerations.
That's awesome, Bob. Your passion for the game, your passion for the Negro Leagues, your love, your knowledge for it all is just incredible. And I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk to me about Bullet Rogan. Again, no relation. To talk to me about Bullet Rogan. Wow, this has been great. Thank you so much.
Warren, it's my pleasure, man. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Anytime. I can't thank Bob enough for joining me on this episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes. Hey, if you're interested, please visit nlbm.com to make a donation, as the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is on a mission to make the museum even better and bigger. That's nlbm.com. Thanks again to Bob for joining us for this great talk about one of the greatest to ever play the game, Bullet Joe Rogan. And thanks to all of you for listening. And I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude. And I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history. But as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.